To really understand why the crown is such a big deal, you have to mentally transport yourself back to Japan in the early 1950s. The country was still trying to pick itself up and rebuild after the devastation of World War II. And honestly, the infrastructure was a mess. Back then, almost every passenger car on the street was actually a foreign knockdown kit. Think Austins, Hillmans, and Renaults that were just shipped over and assembled locally. But Kiichiro Toyota wasn't having any of that. He had this bold vision to flip the script and create a car that wasn't just assembled, but was designed, engineered, and built 100% in Japan from the ground up. So, back in January 1955, the Toyopet Crown first hit the scene. Yeah, they were calling their smaller cars Toyopet back then, a cute name they eventually ditched as the brand grew up. Now, you have to understand the context here. The roads in Japan at the time were absolutely terrible. So Toyota made a really bold move. While everyone else was using heavy-duty truck setups, they decided to slap a double wishbone independent suspension on the front. It was a total game changer because it actually soaked up the bumps instead of breaking your back. Visually, you could spot this thing a mile away because of those rear-hinged suicide doors. That wasn't just a style flex, though. It was genuinely practical, letting dignitaries or folks wearing kimonos get in and out with some actual grace. It even called back to the styling of the Toyota AA, their very first passenger car, so the heritage was there from day one. Under the hood, you had the Type R engine, which was a 1.5-liter inline-4 putting out 48 horses paired with a 3-speed column-shift manual. I know, 48 sounds like nothing today, but for crawling through the low-speed Tokyo traffic of the 50s, it was totally fine. But they got a little overconfident and tried to export it to the US in 1957, which turned into a total disaster. The car was built for slow, bumpy roads, not smooth American highways. The engine was basically screaming at the red line just to keep up with traffic, leading to overheating, and that soft suspension was terrifyingly unstable at 60 miles per hour. Toyota actually had to pull the plug on US exports in 1960, and this forced them to completely rethink how they built cars for high-speed performance. So, after the first Crown took a bit of a beating in the American market, Toyota decided it was time for a serious reset with the second generation. They completely ditched the old-school fenders and the suicide doors, swapping them out for this new flat-deck look that was clearly taking notes from American compacts like the Ford Falcon and Chevy Corvair. But it wasn't just about new sheet metal, it marked a massive shift under the hood with the arrival of the inline-6. In 1965, they dropped in the 2-liter M-Series engine, kicking off a 40-year love affair with the inline-6 layout because, let's face it, nothing beats its natural balance and smoothness. To really cement its status as a luxury cruiser, this generation also introduced the Toyo Glide. It was Japan's first fully automatic torque converter transmission, and even though it was just a 2-speed, it completely changed the driving vibe from a mechanical chore to a relaxed experience. And here's the really cool part. Before the legendary Toyota Century even existed, we had the Crown 8. Launched in '64, this was basically a wider, beefed-up version stuffed with a 2.6-liter V8, built specifically for Japanese execs who wanted something that could rival a Cadillac. It was the direct ancestor that paved the way for the Century to spin off on its own a few years later. Picture Japan in the late 60s. The entire country's infrastructure was leveling up with the opening of the Tomei Expressway, kicking off what they called the highway age. Toyota knew they had to build a car that could handle this new reality. And that's where the third-generation Crown, the S50, came into play. But the biggest shift wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. Before this, the Crown was seen strictly as a chauffeur-driven corporate car or a taxi. Toyota decided to flip the script with the White Crown campaign. They targeted the booming middle class, basically telling everyone that buying a white Crown was the ultimate symbol of personal success and happiness for the everyday driver, not just for CEOs. Under the skin, the engineering was just as important as the marketing. To keep things safe and quiet at these new highway speeds, it introduced a perimeter frame chassis. It's actually really interesting because while European manufacturers were rushing toward unibody construction at the time, Toyota stuck to this separate body-on-frame design for the Crown all the way until 1995. They kept it because that heavy-duty frame offered unbeatable durability and isolated the cabin from the road better than anything else, which is exactly why the taxi industry absolutely loved these cars for decades. The fourth generation is easily the most controversial, but honestly, it's also the most fascinating. Back in 1971, Toyota decided to take a massive gamble to try and shake off their stuffy conservative image. It had such a rounded, tapered profile that everyone started calling it the Kujira, or the whale. But to put it bluntly, the Japanese market absolutely hated it. The corporate buyers thought it looked way too radical and organic, missing that stately, chrome-heavy presence they expected from a luxury sedan. It was a total disaster for Toyota, but it was a gift for Nissan. They launched the Cedric 230 around the same time with that boxy, safe American styling, and buyers flocked to it. For the first and only time in history, the Cedric actually outsold the Crown. The whole experience traumatized Toyota's product planners so much that they immediately went back to playing it safe with a conservative look for the next generation. So, the fifth generation was basically Toyota writing a massive apology letter for the previous generation. They completely pivoted back to what people actually wanted: unapologetically boxy, upright, and formal styling. But the real game changer here was the debut of the legendary Royal Saloon trim. That badge instantly became the benchmark for Japanese luxury, packing in power steering, four-wheel disc brakes, and those famous plush velour seats, which, by the way, are actually preferred over leather in Japan because they're quieter and breathe better in the heat. Under the hood, things got modernized too. They introduced a 4-speed automatic with overdrive to help with highway cruising, and the ME engines finally got electronic fuel injection, so you got much better reliability and smoother cold starts. Alright, so as soon as the 80s hit, the Crown did not hold back. This generation is actually a huge milestone because it was the first time we ever saw a turbocharger in a Crown. They dropped in the MTEU engine as a direct answer to the energy crisis everyone just went through in the 70s. Basically, people still wanted the power of a big engine, but needed the fuel economy of a small one. That turbo gave this heavy sedan a serious surge of torque, which made a massive difference in how it drove. Let's talk about why the 7th generation is such a legend, starting with the culture surrounding it. You honestly can't mention this car without bringing up the iconic catchphrase, "Itsuka wa Crown," or "Someday a Crown." That slogan perfectly captured the vibe of 1980s Japan and positioned this car as the ultimate life goal. The idea was that there was this ladder of success where you'd start out in a Starlet, graduate to a Corolla, move up to a Mark II, and then, finally, when you had truly made it, you bought a Crown. You have to understand the context here. The 8th generation came out right in the middle of Japan's asset price bubble. That basically meant Toyota had a blank check to develop this thing, and it really shows, because it is arguably the absolute peak of traditional Japanese luxury. The tech they crammed into this thing was mind-blowing for the time. And we can't ignore what's under the hood. While the LS400 usually takes all the credit for introducing the legendary 1UZ-F EV8 to the world, the Royal Saloon G actually got that same 4-liter power plant shortly after. It was dead silent, virtually vibration-free and matched the car's vibe perfectly. To keep all that new V8 power in check, they also introduced full-range electronic traction control, which was a huge safety milestone for the era. So, back in 1991, Toyota had to shake things up because the Celsior, what we know as the Lexus LS, had totally changed the game for luxury sedans. To answer that demand, they actually split the Crown lineup into two separate models. At the top, you had the new Crown Majesta. This thing was serious. It ditched the old setup for a modern unibody chassis that it shared with the Aristo, got a V8 engine, and was loaded with cool tech like a heads-up display to give it that big-body Celsior vibe. On the other hand, you had the standard Crown, which held on to the old-school perimeter frame for one last generation. But here's where Toyota dropped the ball. They tried to give the standard model this smooth, rounded rear end, and the traditional buyers absolutely hated it. It was such a sales flop that Toyota was forced to rush out a facelift in 1993 just to square off the back and make it look like a proper Crown again. Let's talk about the 10th gen for a second, because this car was actually a massive turning point. It marked the end of an era for Toyota. See, this is when the standard Crown finally ditched that old-school perimeter frame and switched over to a modern unibody design. Under the hood, this generation is where we really saw VVTi take over the JZ engine lineup, which gave you way better low-end torque and efficiency. And get this, the first time ever they threw in a full-time four-wheel drive system, the i4, on the sedan. That was basically Toyota answering the prayers of everyone driving in those snowy northern parts of Japan. All right, let's talk about the 11th generation. And the real headline here is the Crown Athlete. The Athlete was Toyota's answer to a proper sports sedan. The absolute jewel in the Crown here is the 1JZGTE engine. It's a 2.5-liter turbocharged inline-six that, on paper, makes 276 horsepower, because of that gentleman's agreement, and 279 pound-feet of torque. But let's be honest, they were usually putting down way more power than the brochure said. Finally, we have to mention the Crown Estate. This was the last station wagon ever produced, running until 2007. It combines that practical wagon utility with the 1JZ power plant, making it the ultimate sleeper. In places like the UK and New Zealand, this thing is legendary for embarrassing proper sports cars while hauling the groceries. So, let's rewind to 2003. The Crown had a bit of an image problem. It was basically seen exclusively as an old man's car, and the demographics were aging fast. Toyota knew they had to hit the reset button, so they launched the Zero Crown project to completely reinvent the brand. Now, this brought about the most controversial change of all, the death of the inline-six. Yep, they actually ditched the legendary JZ engines in favor of the new GR Series V6s. See, the V6 configuration is shorter, which allowed Toyota to push the engine further back in the chassis. That vastly improved the weight distribution and handling. And honestly, before you mourn the JZ too much, you have to look at the numbers. The 3.5-liter V6 they introduced later in the generation was pushing out 315 horses. That is significantly more power than you got from a stock 1JZ. It was a massive gamble that paid off. The car was a huge sales success and finally got a younger crowd into the driver's seat. Moving on to the 13th gen, Toyota basically took that revolutionary Zero Crown concept and just refined the heck out of it. But the real game changer here was the introduction of the Crown Hybrid. This wasn't just about saving gas, it was a total performance beast. They paired a 3.5-liter V6 with a high-torque electric motor, which pushed out over 340 horsepower. The crazy part is that even with all that power, it still managed to deliver the fuel economy of a small 2-liter engine, which is honestly the best of both worlds. So, Toyota president Akio Toyoda basically decided he was done with the brand being seen as conservative, so he signed off on a seriously radical design for the athlete trim. We're talking about that massive lightning bolt grille. But the real jaw-dropper? They actually released a limited edition Reborn Pink spec. You have to understand, for 60 years, 90% of these cars were sold in just white, black, or silver. Dropping a bright pink crown was a massive cultural shockwave meant to prove once and for all that Toyota isn't boring anymore. Let's talk about the 15th gen, because this is actually a really interesting case study. First off, this was the first Crown to ride on the TNGAL platform. That is the same rear-wheel drive architecture you find under heavy hitters like the Lexus LC and LS. But here is the kicker. Despite that chassis being absolutely world-class, it really struggled to move units. A lot of buyers felt the interior, which used a new dual-screen setup, just didn't feel luxurious enough. Toyota Alphard, yes, the minivan, was basically cannibalizing its sales because it offered a fancier experience. When you combine that internal competition with the fact that the sedan market was tanking globally, it honestly put the future of the entire Crown nameplate in serious jeopardy. Originally, they just wanted to do a minor update to the old sedan, but the big boss, Akio Toyoda, actually rejected the proposal. He basically told them to scrap it and reinvent the Crown for a world that is obsessed with SUVs. That challenge led to the radical decision to split the Crown into 4 completely different vehicles. The Crossover, for the States, the Sport, which is a compact, agile SUV, the Estate, a large luxury wagon we know as the Signia, and finally a traditional formal sedan. We finally got the nameplate back in the US in 2023, specifically in that crossover form. I know. The purists went absolutely nuts over this because they felt moving away from a rear-wheel drive layout was diluting the Crown's heritage. But if you look at the Platinum trim, things get interesting. It uses the Hybrid Max powertrain, which pairs a 2.4-liter turbo with a high-output rear e-axle. The best part? It ditches the CVT for a proper 6-speed automatic with a wet clutch, so it doesn't feel like a Prius. It's pushing 340 horses and 400 pound-feet of torque, getting you from 0 to 60 in about 5.7 seconds. But here is the kicker for the traditionalists. Toyota actually built a separate Crown sedan just for Japan to keep the diehards happy. This thing is totally unrelated to the crossover we have. It sits on the proper rear-wheel drive GAL platform, making it the true successor to the legendary Majesta.